good morning, and welcome to ISO 55000 airline. My headsets that make me look like a pilot. So welcome, and I will be pretending to be a pilot today. My name is Julia Mamagogo, and I'm your captain for the next 60 minutes. I'm joined by my two co-pilots, Darrell Aberdeen, a respected name in the asset management community. And my other co-pilot is Daisy Kenpetha, also respected name in assets, especially when it comes to infrastructure. So the three of us, we will land you safely on a good path to getting you started with your ISO 55000 certification. I do hope that you will enjoy the session, and please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A, or you can just send a comment in the chat box if you want to just engage. But I really look forward to an engaging session where everyone is contributing. And to kick off the topic of discussion for today, we prepared few questions that I would like you to please answer. They will pop up on your screen. There are 3 questions, and these questions will really help us to understand the level of detail we need to go into as a team. And also we want to use practical examples that are relevant to most of you that will be joining from your respective industry. So Nana, if you can please pop up the poll so we can see the question. There we go. The first question is out. What is your level of awareness and understanding of ISO 55000? Pick an option there, and don't be shy. We're all learning. And even though if your option is not there, it's okay. But I'm joking. You should still pick something at least, just to give us an idea. The questions won't be there for long, so please be quick in just clicking the button. Okay. Right, I'm not sure if you're seeing the answers, but many of you are in the average, so that is good. About 50% of you can average in terms of the ISO 55000 knowledge, and we've got 10% above average. That is great. So I expect the 10% to be engaging with us throughout the session. Great. Now, these days, it's not easy to go into a conversation without mentioning COVID. And before we get to that, the second question has just popped up. Let's answer that first. Okay, let's see the answers. Okay, a big number of you comes from the other sectors, being government, public, renewables. That's good. And we've got mining and minerals. Welcome, everybody. All right, so that gives us an idea on the type of an industry case that is to make reference to for you. And there is a last question that's going to pop up. Let's also deal with that. Then we can take off. All right, the answers are in. 68% of you said no, there's no plan or objective to be ISO 55000, but we've got 32% of you that said yes. Our business wants to be ISO 55001 certified in the future. All right, that's great. Thank you for participating. Now let's talk to those that have a business plan on how to get there, and those that don't have it as a business plan yet. This will also still be informative for you. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's hard these days to talk about anything without mentioning COVID-19. And that is because it really affected everyone, from asset owners, asset operators, and even the general communities were impacted by this. And what we've seen for those who manage assets is that they've had to make some critical decisions on what do we do when they imposed the lockdowns, which meant, they had to bring their shutdown right there and then. And after shutdown, there's also a safe startup. They probably didn't even prepare enough to go into that. So I'm hoping with this discussion that we're going to have, we would also be hearing from you, the asset owners who were, in the midst of this, where you were told by government, shut down, and now you have to prepare to put your machines to rest. And we know some machines you cannot actually just, stop and walk away. There's a lot of safety things you need to consider as well. Someone who's going to help us understand firstly what ISO 55000 is Darrell, Daisy Kenpetha. He's going to give us an overview of what ISO 55000 is all about. And Darrell Aberdeen will be taking us through the step-by-step guidelines, which we made reference to as to what do we need to focus on. to get that ISO 55000 certification? And most importantly, how could getting a good plan could have helped in preparing you for your shutdowns, the imposed lockdowns, and etc. Daisy, again, over to you. Break it down to our audience. What is this thing, asset
Good
management?
stuff. Thank you, Julia. Appreciate it. And good morning again to everyone. Yeah, so I mean, I would like to believe that everyone that's joined the call today would have at least, had some, done some research or knows more or less what ISO 55000 is about. But for the purposes of introductions, we'll touch on, just two definitions. The first being asset management, and keywords there being coordinated activities of an organization to realize value from its assets. And obviously very big emphasis on the objectives of that organization and how those are going to be translated into asset management ones. Then we get to the definition of the asset management system itself, which is not to be confused with software applications, but essentially this is a set of interrelated and interacting elements of an organization whose function would be to carry out asset management activities in the interest of the business. Next slide there, please, Lisa. Cool. So as with all ISO standards, ISO 55000 also sort of consists of three parts. Of course, 55000 being the asset management overview, dealing with the principles, terminology, and so on. Then there is, of course, 55001, which is then the management system requirements for asset management. And lastly, the more recently published in 2018 ISO 55002, which is the guidelines for the application of 55001. Of course, if you guys have done your research, you'd be quite familiar with these three standards already. Next slide, please. Cool. So just to touch on the asset management fundamentals, sort of as they're defined by the landscape document. Of course, we have value. And asset management is not just focused on the asset itself, but rather on the value that the asset can provide to an organization. Value, of course, which can be tangible, intangible, financial, or non-financial, and ultimately, will be determined by the organization and its stakeholders in accordance with the organization's objectives. Of course, alignment, another critical one, and this is really where asset management decisions, be it technical, financial, or operational, will collectively enable the achievement of the organizational objectives. Another critical one being leadership, and this is really speaking to the leadership and commitment from all managerial levels, which is absolutely essential for successful establishment of an asset management system and ensuring that it's operating and that there is improvements and so on and so forth. All too often we find in organizations that you get a few asset management champions, but if there is that lack of support from top management, there's always going to be issues with regards to actually getting that process properly embedded, within your organization. And then lastly, assurance. Everybody wants peace of mind, and you need assurance that you're going to be able to effectively govern your organization according to the asset management principles that you are using. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of how ISO 55000 is actually going to help you achieve all of those fundamental sort of that we looked at in the slide before. Of course, stakeholder alignment, very big emphasis on stakeholder identification, documentation, communication accordingly to those different stakeholders. Very big part of this exercise. Of course, top management accountability and involvement, having documented and communicated policies, strategies, and plans. I mean, it's one thing to have these documents, but whether they're actually collecting dust on a shelf or whether they're actually being used by the people within the organization on a regular basis is a critical one. Of course, risk management needing to be in place is also important. Through the process of doing this, you'll also be able to identify all of the necessary resources, put those in place, close the skills gap, so to speak. Of course, you need to ensure that processes are documented and again, communicated, and very importantly, change managed. It's quite, common to find that, processes may be changed on the fly to sort of allow for more efficiencies, but whether that's actually, then documented accordingly and ultimately communicated to everyone is a whole other story. Again, leading on from sort of the top management involvement would be the management review process. And, that's a critical one as well in terms of just being able to have metrics and audits and review routines on a regular basis. And lastly, but surely, of course, continual improvement, because you always need to be, building on the current, sort of practice and ensuring that you get to a more sustainable state of asset management within your organization. So yeah, that's pretty much my slides for now. Well, just one more, if we can go to the next one, please, is just to touch on the rating scale. So of course, when we would embark on this sort of assessment, it would be important to then rate your maturity, against each of the clauses in ISO or the key performance areas, so to speak. And quite simply, it's just to be able to say, are you unaware? Are you intending? Are you in a state of progressing? Or are you, fortunately ISO compliant, or in some instances also beyond ISO? And quite simply, this rating would be applied to each clause, and that would be rolled up to give you sort of an overall maturity sort of rating to say that, this is where you're sitting as an organization. And what's really important about this is, this ultimately, from an exercise of this nature, it will allow you to be able to say, these are the things that we're actually doing right within our organization in terms of asset management and ISO compliance. Let's build on that. Let's expand on that. And what are the things that we are abysmally failing at, and what can we start to put in place to, correct those, sort of actions, and ultimately progress to the next level and beyond. Cool. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Daryl Aberdeen, who's going to talk about the more sort of tangible items.
Thank you very much, Dasigan. We're getting now to the actual step-by-step process. So that's what we promised in the title, was we would take it through step by step. And instead of doing a theoretical step-by-step, what I'm going to be presenting now is an actual real case study, an actual client of ours in South Africa. I can't mention the name, unfortunately. Public sector client who decided they want to embark on ISO 55000. And this is their plan. Now, everyone's plan will be different. Everyone, if you're a large mining house, your plan will be slightly different from this. It'll be bigger or smaller or broader, whatever it is. But this is a plan that was put in place for a particular public sector client, a fairly small public sector client. They're not very big in what they do, and relatively immature, which means that a lot of what needed to be put in place isn't in place and has to be put in place. So it gives us a fairly good spectrum of everything that needs to happen. They didn't have very much. Obviously, we started off with some sort of assessment, gap analysis, which is typical. That was the assessment that Dasigan referred to. And we looked at what was in place and what wasn't in place. And we said, this is what you need to do. It addresses all of those points that Dasigan talked about. And the first point that the discussion went around is, what is the entity that is going to be certified as ISO 55 compliant? And ISO 55000 allows you to define what that entity is, which you want to be certified as compliant. And it's actually it's good if you spend some time thinking about this, because the decision is actually quite a big one and it has a lot of implications. So the first one, the first consideration is, it's all very well to say, we're a major mining house. We want to become, as a mining house, ISO 55 compliant, certified. The question that ISO then asks is, or insists, that says that top management shall, the word top management is used extensively throughout ISO 55000. And top management, I think it's defined in 55000, something like management at the highest level. It doesn't give you very many options. And you're a major international mining house, management at the highest level probably is, they're sitting somewhere, not even in South Africa, somewhere else. It becomes really impractical. So defining that entity, and probably you want to take it somewhere down the organization to an operating entity or something like that, where you have practical access. Management has practical is something you can touch and feel. They real people actually working on a particular plant or particular mine or particular organization. Not a the second one is, so that says perhaps we might not want to make it at the most senior level the top of the hierarchy. The second one is, at what level is it not practical to take it down any further? And there I rely on that third clause, which says an organization is a person or group of people that has its own functions with responsibilities, authorities, and relationships to achieve its objectives. So if you define the organization too low, it becomes a subunit which doesn't have the responsibilities, authorities, and relationship. It just doesn't have the authority to change things, to appoint staff, to appoint contractors, to change processes, to be able to achieve the objectives. So somewhere between those two things, practically we need to get a top management team, which is is top management, but is useful top management, something that can really make a difference. And the organization being such that it's high enough up that they really do have control over the authorities, the resources, the people, the decisions, that they can make those decisions to achieve those objectives. So somewhere between in a huge conglomerate, you will perhaps bring it down 1 or 2 levels, but you certainly won't take it down. What I would call a business unit is probably the lowest level that would comply with that 3.1.1. A business level, some people call it a strategic business unit, something like that, but certainly not a portion of the plant or a department in a plant. I don't think that gives, if it's just the engineering department, that doesn't give you that integrated silo-less approach that ISO 55000 aspires to. So this decision is probably one of the most important first steps that you need to be able to take. Once you've made that decision, you can then start defining the next steps. It's almost impossible to define the next steps without having this basic decision made. What is the entity? So that was the first one, and that probably takes quite a bit of thinking and discussion to get that decision correct before you can move to the next one. Thank you, Lisa. Next slide, please. So in our real live example that we had, we started off with, or we developed a roadmap, and the bottom row of this, and I know it's very small on the screen, but I'm going to put a slide up for each of those activities down the bottom. Those bottom activities are essentially the foundation of ISO 55000, the in place rather than the in use. So as you move up to the second row, you start getting the more in use stuff. And the in-use activities that we would want to do. And the top row is the continual improvement. I'm not going to talk too much about the continual improvement, but obviously that is part of the whole journey. But getting yourself certified is the bottom row, and then moving into the second row, putting it in place, and very quickly being able to show that what you have is in use. There are the records and the documents coming out which are reflecting the bottom row happening. So I'm going to go through these ones one by one, and thank you, Lisa. Next. So this was the steps. At the end, I'm going to show you a little bit of a bar chart, a Gantt chart, which just puts these steps in a timeline so that you can see how they interact with each other and which ones we would generally do first, which one we do second, which ones overlap, which ones lag, which ones are first, and how they react, how they interact with each other. But one of the first things we needed to do is we needed to put the governance structures in place. because very quickly in ISO 55000, there are decisions that need to be made. We need to appoint a, let's call it an ISO 55000 coordinator person. We need to start approving processes and procedures. We need to start implementing a communication strategy, and you need governance in order to be able to do that. In this, our particular example, again, there was an executive committee that was at top management in that organization, and we picked select members. So it was an engineering manager, an operating manager, and a support stroke finance type person in that organization, and they became the asset management subcommittee, and that was the governance at that was top management as far as ISO, and they became the steering committee to take this all forward. So we developed this. We identified the people for the steering committee, developed agendas, meeting structures, how often they would meet, how they would delegate downwards. In this particular case, there was an executive person that actually was doing a lot of the work that was part of the steering committee, or the doer in the steering committee. And then, as is always so important, ISO insists, and for good reason, identify the stakeholders and understand what their needs are. In government, stakeholders are complex. As you can imagine, they tend to have to keep Department of Finance happy. They tend to have to keep all sorts of other departments happy. And there's unions, there's staff, there's all sorts of people that and value in a government organization is not generally defined in terms of money. So understanding what value is in government is really quite a difficult job, but it's the important thing that had to be done. We started documenting that. We put an organizational structure in place for executing asset management. Just the people that have to do the things within asset management. Who's going to draw up the strategy? Who's going to, or the SAMP? Who's going to draw up the policy? Who's going to chair the meetings? So having all of that, and as part of that, we put in a little training program for the steering committee members, because quite a bit is expected of them, and that you want them to understand why they're making decisions. So we put a program in place, had them trained over a couple of days so that they know what to do. And I think this last point there, ISO insists on it. Almost every clause in ISO says you must communicate what you've done. So every step on this process has got a last line which says communicate, create awareness. Sometimes I call it change management, which is exactly or perhaps a slightly different concept, but more or less the same. But without, it's good practice in any case, but ISO really says that every step along the way, make sure that everyone that needs to know about this thing is informed. Next one, Lisa. So the next thing that we put in place, and this needed to be approved by the steering committee, was, and I call it the charter, but it's all the good stuff that we know that ISO insists of. Asset management policy. We split the policy into call it a strategic policy and a framework, which is what good looks like, perhaps at a tactical level, and wrote up the SAMP. We started putting plans in place, and any of you have dealt with asset management plans, the Clause 6 plans. It's not a process that is a 10-minute process. There are lots of plans in place. We set up the framework for the plans. We incorporated the plans which existed, and we set up a process to develop the rest of the plans. But that wasn't, all of the plans aren't in place as we speak. That's going to take us a while to get to fill up those boxes in terms of the plans. And again, the last line, communicate, change management, all of the rest of the things. Next one, Lisa. So the next one, the next big chunk that we decided to tackle in this was that one of the foundations of any change like this is to make sure that we have competent people, that we have the right people in the right place, we have enough people in each of the particular areas. And we went through defining I call it a RASCI, responsible, accountable, I can't remember what RASCI stands for, but it's all of the, supports the process, is communicated and is informed. We put together this RASCI diagram for the organization for the asset management responsibilities. And based on that, we developed a competence matrix, which says, if you are doing this, this is what your competence needs to be, and this is how you need to get there. This is dependent quite a bit. It's very difficult to develop any form of responsibility matrix without the processes in place. So you'll see processes are coming up now, and the processes have to lead this activity somewhat. Otherwise, it's very difficult to define what the actual responsibilities are unless you understand what exactly those processes are. Thank you. Next one, Lisa. Right. The next big step that we had to put in place, the next big foundation, was 2 sets of information management blocks. And the first one was the one that you really depend on initially, and that is our EAMS, making sure that we have a work management system that talks to supply chain materials management, and get that in place, configure that the way it to reflect what is in the good practices, in the policies, in the procedures that you developed, and set that up in the right way, document what we call the blueprint, which is the recipe, how this thing looks, the way it's all set up. And with this one, there is a lot of communication rollout. I'm using some sort of change management process to make sure that everyone is aware of what they have to do with their work orders, what they have to do when they order spares. We did a second round of this one, phase 2, if you could go next, please, where we looked at all of the rest. Next, Lisa. Thank you. We looked at all of the rest of the information management systems, and you would be surprised, I'm sure, in your own organization, how many of these exist. And some of them exist in Excel spreadsheets, some of them are formal system, anything from time and attendance, on a mine, there's metal accounting, on safety systems, risk systems. How do these get, and this was a phase 2, which we didn't tackle immediately, but how do these get integrated into asset management? And sometimes you might say it's not necessary to integrate them. They can be standalone with a manual interface. Sometimes you want to say they are fully integrated. Again, this is a little bit dependent, quite a bit dependent on our business processes that we define and how those business processes roll out, because it's difficult to do this if you don't understand what your business process is requiring you to do. Next, Lisa. So again, the last supporting one, we've talked about people type resources. We've talked about information management resources. The last one is the document management system. Documents are part of the way we communicate within ISO. You write a procedure, you write a policy, you need a formal way of documenting that, making sure that everyone has got working to the right drawing and the right revision, and you need a formal way of managing your records so that you're filing stuff in the right place that you can get access to them later if you need it. For our purposes, we didn't know, and we still don't know whether we need a document management system. So this whole process here was to scope our DMS, our document management system, decide really what are our needs and what needs to happen. And then if maybe at some stage in the future, if the Microsoft filing system lets you down, maybe we need something more sophisticated than that, we can go out there and we can procure that one. Right, and again, you can see rollout with change management. Every single time there is a communication aspect to all of these ones. Just as an aside, possibly, for this one, we did a cost estimate for this particular client, and we tried to cost the effort of the client along with the effort of the consultants. And there's more, and it's to be expected, there's more effort required to go in from the client side to do the change management, to implement it, than there is from a consultant, a lot more. So that ends, just people going on training courses and being trained and running workshops, participating in workshops is a major activity in a project like this. Next slide, please, Lisa. So this is our particular client. Those of you that know ISO clause 8.1 says, go away and define your processes that are important to you. I'm not quoting it exactly, and go and document them, identify the risks in those processes, resource those processes, manage change, etc., etc. That's what you need to do. And for our particular client, these were the ones we identified as being the core processes, which we needed to document and roll out with change, etc. The clause right at the bottom is there. But yours will be slightly different. But this is probably the most expensive and biggest activity that you probably will have as part of your ISO 55000 implementation. A lot of you will have a lot of these in place already. This particular client didn't have that many in place, or they were very immature. So this was the biggest cost and the biggest time that we needed to spend on this project. Next slide, please, Lisa. You can almost feel us getting towards the end of ISO clause 9 in ISO, which says how do we monitor our performance, developing a set of metrics, KPIs, documenting them, rolling them down so that we have a dashboard that various people in the organization at different levels with line of sight can use these metrics. Looking for a tool. This particular client didn't have a business intelligence tool, and looking for a tool that could work for them during they could use for metrics analysis and improvement. And again, making sure that our governance structures at various levels, the meetings, the routines, these are reported to those meetings, that they can make the right decisions and they know what has to come from there. Thank you. Next slide, please, Lisa. And putting this together, that's the 7 areas. The very last one is the actual audit process, which I'm not going to talk about. We have covered the actual audit process in previous webinars. That's getting your certification body in, and actually to do that, that's quite a way in the future. But this was the logic, and you can see number 1 and number 2 happen early on, as early as you can can do them. Get your leadership in place, get them appointed, and get them making decisions, particularly around the asset management policy, SAMP, and objectives, and getting getting that in place. And then start working on all of the other ones. If you see number 6 precedes almost every one of the other things out there, because a lot of what happens in number 6, that's the processes that you document, affect information management, affects competence, affects your affects a lot of the other things. So that one we started early and tried to get a lot of that in place, with as much overlap as we could, to otherwise it just takes too much time. So that was the logic of this thing. And information management took a long time, I think, because it was defining, we had the 2 phases there, one for the work management type activities and one for all the other activities. Yeah, so that's the overall program. I think that's all that I have. You can go to the next slide. I think the next slide is just thank you. So I think I'm going to hand back to Julia now for questions, and I think there's another poll.
Yes, this is time for another poll. Thank you so much, Daryl and this again. Nagamso, if you can please push the poll there while we wait for the questions to come in. So you should see the polls now, the questions. So we're asking, does your business utilize any system like CMMS or EMS? I need to respond to, so I can just click this away. Okay, and remember to please use the Q&A chat box for your questions there. We will get to them shortly after this poll. I'm stuck on the first question. I hope everyone is going through the rest of them. I'm still seeing question 4. Okay, so 59% of you do have an enterprise asset management system. And that tells me information access would have been easier for you during the COVID-19 start to make some decisions on your assets. Let's go to the next question. Does your business subscribe to any of the ISO standards? Your quality standards, environmental standards, security? If you answer yes to any, I would imagine then that makes it much more easier if you embark on this journey, because there is someone in your organization who has gone through ISO standard, and that always helps because the process is almost the same. It's just the content that changes depending on what that standard is about. 76% of you said yes, you do have some sort of a standard in your organization. All right, that's good. That's always good. Then you can just find out who was leading that for you to embark on your ISO 55000 to make it much more easier. Why reinvent the wheel when someone has gone through the trouble of understanding the process itself? And this is the last question. How quick did your business adapt to lockdown, shutdowns, and startups? Did you have a system in place to make decisions quicker? Or you didn't know where to start? While we wait for the answer for this one, I just want to take Daryl and Daisy back to the first point, which is on top management. Daryl, you've emphasized it enough as being critical, but let's pause it there and address the answers. I see they're just in. So many of you say, many being 28, about 50%, it was moderate. Okay, so you had some systems in place, but not all. And about 18% of you said they did not know where to start. And I'd imagine for things like records, Daryl touched on records and documentation management there. If you were to put off a machine and there's a process to follow, a procedure to follow, you would want to know how do you then put that machine away and what you still need to do while it's not running. But without that information, you wouldn't know what to do. Those are some of the challenges that asset operators and managers faced when COVID-19 hit us. And I hope we've learned the lessons from all of that. Daryl, let's go back to the top management. I find that very important because in my experience, we get calls from clients, they'll put together an objective to say, we wish to embark on this ISO 55000 journey. And when you start asking where that decision came from, it would have came from the plant level mostly, or the engineering and operations, not so much from the CEO level, or whoever must make the final decision in that. Can we just spend time on that? Lisa, if you can please go to that slide that talks about the top management. In a environment where there are many stakeholders, if we take the public sector as an example, you've got the Department of Water and Sanitation, when we talk about water boards, who is a key stakeholder in that process. You've got the National Treasury also a key stakeholder, then the actual water board organization, the board, the executive manager committee. In that environment, who would we have to make sure we get on board to making the decision making much more quicker? I don't think going to the minister would help in the process because they are almost unavailable. But let's just spend time on that. How do we lower down the decision making so that we can make decisions quicker? We've seen with COVID-19, people had to make decisions quicker, and there was just not time to be going back to National Treasury or Minister of Minerals or even the CEOs. So your comments on that, Des, I would also like to hear your input. And I invite anyone, especially the 10% that was above average, please do post your message, your answers in there, or just request for you to be unmuted. I would really like to hear from you. How would you define top management in this scenario? Daryl?
Yeah, I'll start off. Now, the worst thing that can happen, exactly as you say, someone in the organization, not at the bottom of the organization, but someone gets it on their performance targets for the year to say, get X, Y, and Z water board certified. And they start fighting this fight from the bottom upwards, and they've got no influence over the, what happens in the organization. Those principles that ISO 55000 is an integrated, coordinated approach between departments, and one planner at the bottom of the organization or halfway down the organization is never going to be able to get an integrated approach. So practically, I do think it's a little bit, it'd be nice, top management. It says management at the highest levels. Maybe the CEO is going to be a little bit impractical. There is almost always an executive committee. Not everyone on that executive committee, ExCo, has asset management, is directly involved in asset management. Take a few of them. Engineering, facilities, depending what sort of organization you're in, the operations side, and some of the support functions, maybe HR, maybe finance, and form a subcommittee, an asset management subcommittee. They don't have to have day-to-day asset management activities. So they just have to give overall, have to be managed the process from a fairly high level, and provide the overall direction. The leadership, I think, is the word that ISO uses quite extensively. Provide the leadership, and leadership means they can sit in a meeting once every 2 months or once every quarter. They can have an execution group which can report to them and actually execute a lot of the activities. It doesn't mean they have to do everything, but if there's a conflict, if there's a decision to be made about how things need to integrate, they can make those balances and say the correct decision for the organization, not for engineering or production alone for the silo, the correct decision for the organization is this, we will do it that way. So that's a practical way of doing it. I have seen it in a water board where they would have considered a region and said this region, top management in this region would be, and the region is headed by a general manager type person. That could also very easily work. In each region, there's an executive committee, an engineering manager, production manager, something like that. That can also work. Good.
Thank you, Darrell, for that. Yeah, and someone agrees with you. That is Louis, or is it Robert? Robert, do you want to say something? Should we unmute you just to give us your input? I'm interested to hear from you. If we can unmute Robert, please. If you are camera shy, Robert, you don't have to put your camera, but let's just hear your voice at least.
Julia, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, I wouldn't even know how to switch my camera on, so I'm not going to even attempt it. But yes, I fully agree with what Darrell is saying, that we need top management cooperation, because as you were saying, there might be a plan at the bottom of the organization that's been told he has to implement ISO 55000. If you don't have that commitment and that drive from top management, it's never ever going to work.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, the messages are coming in, and let me switch over to the Q&A quickly. Boyki Sibobi, let's hear your voice. Can we unmute Boyki there, please, so we can just get him or her to say something, but I'll read the question in the meantime. It's quite safe to say idea for the organization to embark on an asset management journey has to come from top management and stakeholders. It's a question.
Yes.
I don't necessarily think it needs to, if I can add there, Julia, I don't necessarily think it needs to come from top management, but it certainly needs to be supported and driven by top management. And that's how you will ultimately ensure the results.
Oh, okay, then. All right. No, thank you very much for the comment. But yes, top management has to also be interested, and they also have to be aware and or agreeable to it if they know the value of embarking upon that. Because I suppose if somebody from the lower quartile of the organization, say, maybe sell that idea to them, if they don't understand what you're talking about, it's very difficult for them to support that idea.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
100%. And it's not something that top management can just delegate and leave it to do its own thing. They need to be actively involved and engaged, and hence why the standard also emphasizes the need for like an asset management steering committee. Julia, you also made quite a few points earlier about, like, especially in the public sector realm, where there's so much of influences, whether it's the different departments or treasury and so on and so forth. And I think that second point there about identifying internal, which I think a lot of the times organizations get right, but external stakeholders and external influences, be it the legislation and, what do we need to comply with and who is going to be influenced by whatever we're doing. I think sometimes we often find big gaps in that particular space. So I think something as simple as just actually having a stakeholder workshop and having a simple stakeholder register is always a good starting block. And strangely enough, you can go into quite a lot of organizations and even departments that have been around for ages. And if you have to ask for a stakeholder register, you'll really struggle to find one. So that I think is incredibly important as well when it comes to leadership and governance.
Thank you, Daisy, again.
Julia?
Yes.
We have two questions in the chat section. I'm going to read the first one for you. It was mentioned that ISO 55000 can apply to intangible assets. How different is this process of applying this standard for intangible assets compared to tangible assets? So that's the first. And then the second is, when documenting the process, is it just the as is instance, or do you get to the point where you are required to improve them first? So those are the two questions, panel.
Let me take the second.
Thank you,
the
Lisa.
second question, which is actually in the chat. It's got a 1 next to it, so it's the first question, because I know what the answer is for the first question. The second one is a bit more difficult. The first one is, ISO is actually a very interesting document, and it's the way ISO has been put together, all of the ISO standards, to say that we don't necessarily have to have a perfect solution the first time round. So it'll ask you to say, have you documented it? Has it been approved by the right people? Have you considered risk? Have you done various things? And then it will say, are you continually improving this? And the important thing is more the continual improvement. So an existing procedure is not necessarily bad. Identifying the gaps between that and your policy or your framework, and identifying any improvements is more important in ISO than actually getting it right the first time. And that was a major change from when ISO 9000 came out in what, about 2000, 1995, somewhere around there, where they expected perfection from the beginning. And they later realized that actually improvement is more important than perfection. And ISO 55000 has embraced that improvement process. The second question is, I really don't know. I've never done something with intangible assets. It's in theory, ISO 55001 is a very is very broadly defined. Yeah, it's very broad. It's less than, it's 10 pages long. It makes very broad sweeping statements. So in theory, it could be equally applicable. I think most of us have sort of accepted that, even though it talks about assets, that anything can create value, we really are mostly thinking about physical assets. So the old PAS 55 was specifically physical assets. ISO 55000 defined it more broadly, but almost everyone that I know of is talking about physical assets here, not intangible assets. So I don't really know. I'm sure it will be different, but I don't know how different it is.
I'm interested to hear from Sylvia.
On that one as well. Can I add on that one first?
Sure.
So I agree. I think also, that whole thing about considering the extent of the assets within the organization. I think if you've got a mix of tangible and intangible, then it probably makes more sense. But to give another example, you got to really look at your asset base. So all too often, we also may find organizations that are sort of doing facilities management and just dealing with generally building type assets that would consider a standard like ISO 55000, when in actual fact they can consider the facilities management standard, which is ISO 41000, which is probably a lot more applicable. So I would think if you're only dealing with intangible assets, then it's probably not going to make sense for you to now go and get certified against 55001. But if you do have a mix of both tangible and intangible, then that's a bigger extent of your assets that you can then certify against that standard, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Daisy, for that. Can we hear from Sylvia? What kind of assets is she referring to? Yeah, the intangible asset. If you can unmute Sylvia, please.
I would imagine software.
Sylvia, are you there? Can you hear us? What are those things that you work with which we can't touch or even see and feel?
It's in the cloud.
It's in the cloud, yes. All right. I don't think we've got Sylvia.
Just on the IT stuff, it's interesting that ISO 55000, I can't remember whether it's the first or the second version of 55002, which is the guidelines, mentions that we should consider information as an asset in its own right. So information is a support to asset management, physical asset management, but information is also should be considered and managed as an asset in its own right. There's Sylvia now. I don't know if Sylvia can
All
talk.
right. Can you guys hear me now?
We
Yes.
can. Welcome.
All right, thank you. Yeah, you were right when you said I was talking in with regards to software. So I once did my final year project in terms of the asset management, but then it was with tangible assets. So now I'm in the IT industry. So I wanted to know how it can be applicable, like applied. So I hear you that it's going to be a bit difficult. Okay.
Yeah, no, when we can't touch, feel, and maybe even smell it, Sylvia, we can't use the standard.
All right. Okay. Thank you for the responses.
And
We
thank
could
you
use
for
the
your
standard, it'll just be a
questions.
simpler sort of in comparison to tangible.
Sorry?
No, I was saying you could still probably apply the standard. It's just that it'll be a lot more simpler because you're not dealing with physical assets.
Yes, because now, remember, it's going to be difficult now to also convince leadership, as they're supposed to be the ones that buy into this. So it's easier with physical assets to convince someone that rather than intangible ones.
Sure.
Great. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. We've come to the end of our journey. I hope we have landed you safely to the plan that I promised you at the start of the webinar. If there are still more questions, you are more than welcome to contact myself, Daryl, or Desigan. You can also visit the Pragma website to fill in the contact form there. We would be happy to assist you. And from my team and the rest of the Pragma community in asset management, we thank you for your attendance, and let's catch up again for another journey in the future. That's it from your captain, Julia. Thanks,
Over
everyone.
and out. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Cheers, then.
Take care.